All right, guys, this is a really kick-ass episode for you with Dr. James Steele, an associate professor and researcher in sport and exercise science, and just an all-around really knowledgeable guy in the field of training. Now, this is part 3 of something really cool, which I titled the Volume Month, where we are trying to tease apart how you can best go about optimizing your training volume, one of, if not the most important component of your training. In the first 2 episodes, we had Menno Henselmans and Mike Israetel on, and this time I thought I would get on someone who represents a bit of a different school of thought on all of this. So in this episode, we will delve into the role of effort in training and how that plays an important role for muscle growth, and how many people might be overlooking that when they are trying to optimize their training. So if this sounds interesting to you, then I hope you will enjoy this episode. Consider subscribing and hit that bell notification icon to see when our next episode will be live with our next guest expert, and also for content in the future on topics such as this one, because there is a lot of that on this YouTube channel. So once again, I hope you will enjoy this episode, and with that, let's jump in. There are a lot of interesting and intriguing discussions over what are the main drivers of muscle growth. And I know you have given some talks about this and published some papers which were trying to investigate this. So as of recent times, what has been your thinking around this topic? So how do you think about the main drivers that are really contributing towards muscle growth? Maybe that's a good initial question to start with.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And it's something that I've changed my mind on several times over the years. I think initially my thinking was primarily around this concept of motor unit recruitment as being the most important sort of factor relating to stimulation of adaptation to exercise. And but early on, I think I kind of like just bought into that as being the primary stimuli without really thinking about, well, that's a kind of mechanism that might lead to other mechanisms on a more molecular level that result in an adaptive response. And you know, over the last probably 5 to 10 years, there's been a lot of work coming out looking at mechanistic elements of hypertrophic response, in particular to resistance exercise. And if you look back at sort of Brad Schoenfeld's 2010 paper, he posed, 3 sort of primary mechanisms for hypertrophic adaptation. Mechanical tension, so the effect of kind of mechanical tension and sensing of that, and mechanotransduction to upregulate the kind of molecular processes involved with muscle protein synthesis. The role of muscle damage as well, and also the role of metabolic stress as being the kind of, I suppose, trifecta of mechanisms that are involved in hypertrophic response. And I think since then, I tried to sort of reconcile this idea of, well, on a practical sense, conditions that we think lead to maximal motor unit recruitment seem to potentially optimize adaptation. So maybe it's through some of these more mechanistic elements. Maybe it is that maximal motor unit recruitment results in high levels of mechanical tension. Maybe it results in muscle damage, and maybe it enhances metabolic stress. I think in more recent years, though, probably the last 2 or 3 years, the role of metabolic stress and muscle damage in particular have been sort of questioned, and there's been work that's come out that potentially suggests that they might be red herrings of sorts. They're mechanisms that occur during the types of conditions that we know lead to hypertrophic adaptation, but they might not necessarily be primary drivers or mechanisms in and of themselves. And in fact, Brad, along with a number of other colleagues, Henning Wackeridge and Lee Hamilton, etc., just recently published a new updated review called Stimuli and Sensors that Initiate Skeletal Muscle Hypertrophy Following Resistance Exercise. Now, caveat is I've not actually read the whole paper yet. I've just given it a quick skim because it's only been out for about a week. But it seems as though, this updated review is leaning towards mechanical tension and, sensing of mechanical tension and subsequent sort of mechanotransduction to upregulate pathways relating to protein synthesis seem to be the primary sort of like mechanistic driver of hypertrophic response. So I think my thinking has kind of come full circle in the sense that I've always felt that recruitment of motor units and thus, the experiencing of the muscle fibers in those motor units, them experiencing mechanical tension is a primary driver. And I think more recently we're realizing that, that is the case.
Thank you for that elaborate discussion over this. And with that, so this mechanical tension component, there's a variety of ways in which we can go about inducing mechanical tension on the muscle. And typically when we talk about kind of targeting growth with training, we talk about a couple of factors. One of them is progressive overload. So lifting more weights or doing more reps over time, just making the exercise bout more challenging over time. Another one is proximity to failure. So training pretty close to failure to make it with a more intensity of effort. And then there's training volume, which is the amount of volume that we, or the volume of training that we perform. So how high do you think amongst all the things that we can do to elicit muscle growth volume ranks? So how important is training volume compared to other factors in training?
That's a really good question. So I guess we have to think carefully about how we're sort of conceptualizing volume, because there's lots of different ways to manipulate the volume of resistance training that you do. And we can think about ways of manipulating volume within session or over, longer periods of time. So more recently, there seems to, historically, I should start with, the arguments are always about number of sets performed within session, whether that's sets per exercise or sets per muscle group. Whereas more recently, the discussion has shifted, it seems, towards more discussion of a set volume over a period of a week. And I think that's because there's been more interest in frequency as a way of potentially increasing volume. An increase in frequency, but maintenance of volume within session can result in a greater volume over a period of time. I think if I was to sort of like rank those three things that you kind of listed, as many people will probably know, I'm a proponent of the importance of sufficient intensity of effort in any kind of exercise, particularly in resistance training. And so I think that there is considerable importance to training with sufficient proximity to task failure or momentary failure. And I think, if you don't have that, then other variables seem to be seem to not really make too much of a difference. Or indeed, if you match the intensity of effort between conditions, it's questionable the degree to which other variables have an impact on the adaptive response. So I think if I was to rank the first, it would probably be intensity of effort. I think it's a little bit more difficult to figure out exactly where volume lies in that, because I think you can think about it from a practical sense as well. And so one of the things, for example, that we've discussed is this idea that volume can be used in and of itself to increase the intensity of effort of the work that you're doing. So if you're performing submaximal sets in the sense that you're not training to failure, subsequent sets are going to be performed in a condition of fatigue, which resulted from the previous sets. And so maintaining the same load or same repetition number, each set is going to feel progressively harder. So it's a way of increasing the intensity of effort in and of itself. So sorry, I feel like I'm rambling there and I've lost track of what the original question was.
Yeah, so basically you answered it pretty much already. So the question was, how high does volume rank amongst all the things that we can do in training to elicit muscle growth? So you would use, if I interpret what you just said correctly, it ranks somewhere below intensity of effort, so going pretty close to failure, right?
Yeah, I would say that. I think particularly with respect to hypertrophy, I would say that I think if I had to rank kind of intensity of effort, volume, and load, I would probably do it in that order. Primarily because from a practical sense, volume can be used to manipulate the intensity of effort. If intensity of effort is matched, though, we know that loads typically produce, a variety of different loads typically produce similar responses.
Yeah, so just want to pick up on something that you just mentioned in the beginning. So you just mentioned, as you started answering the previous question, was that there is a number of ways in which we can quantify training volume. And I know that some people in the high-intensity training crowd, for example, seem to think that counting sets and reps is not a good proxy for training volume, and a much better way would be to look at time under load. So what is your kind of favorite definition to quantify training volume?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in most cases I see the argument that's often made from the sort of high intensity training crowd around that, because they're thinking about comparisons of a typical sort of quote unquote HIIT protocol, which typically involves longer repetition duration, so more time under load, whereas they typically see the 3 sets of 10 or whatever typical kind of recommendation is normally repetition duration isn't something that's given much consideration, and so repetitions are done more quickly. And they often try and sort of like draw those comparisons. I think we got to be careful though, because there's actually very little research that has compared, those two, what would be called ecologically valid interpretations of training approaches. The typical kind of high intensity training HIIT style versus the typical kind of higher volume approach. And most studies that have looked at manipulating volume do tend to control between the conditions, either higher volume or lower volume, the repetition duration that's used. And so I think, we published a study with colleagues in Germany, Dr. Jürgen Giesing, which did look at, in untrained individuals, a typical kind of quote-unquote HIIT approach of single sets done with a relatively slow repetition duration, also with drop sets versus a kind of 3 sets of 10 not to failure. I believe there was no control of repetition duration for those sets either, and found that there was positive adaptations in both conditions, but that the quote-unquote HIIT group seemed to do slightly better. But we ascribe that as potentially being due to the higher intensities of effort that were achieved during the high-intensity training intervention. But yeah, there's not a lot of research that's compared differences in volume by manipulation of time under load. To my knowledge, there's some work that's looked at acute protein synthetic responses and seems to suggest that higher time under loads might be better for acute increases in muscle protein synthesis. So if I recall rightly, I think one of Stuart Phillips' PhD students from a while back, Cameron Mitchell, did some work around that, but I'm trying to sort of like recall that off the top of my head. So I think to kind of get back to the question, I don't really have a favoured way of quantifying volume, or at least not one that has been looked at in the literature. I think there is a potential interesting way of looking at it, which I think Borge has kind of used in the past, which is the number of times or essentially a way of quantifying it based upon intensity of effort and the amount of time spent at different intensities of effort. So, for example, if you're doing 1 set to failure, you've achieved, maximal effort once during the workout. Is there additional benefit from achieving, repeating that and achieving failure multiple times? It would be a difficult thing to examine, though, in the sense of the volume of exposures to that kind of failure event, or even differing proximities to failure, whilst also trying to control volume in the sense of the number of repetitions performed, or even based on volume load. So it would be a tricky way of doing it, but I think that's a potential way of looking, or that's an interesting avenue for research to take. So just to clarify for those listening, I think what you were referring to previously with Børge Fagerli's concept of quantifying volume, which is not even necessarily a way of quantifying volume, but just a very useful proxy for quantifying the quality of your workout, which is the number of kind of effective reps which you're stimulating in any given set.
And I would completely agree with you in that the type of failure that is achieved by some of the high intensity crowd in their training sessions is probably not comparable to the type of failure that is reported in studies when they say that we did 10 sets of squats to failure. Most probably in that latter case, it's mainly just people stopped doing squats when it got pretty challenging and they just kind of wussed out, for lack of a better term. Just speaking of volume for just a few more seconds, what do you think about the recent kind of emerging literature that is pretty strongly indicating a kind of dose-response relationship between training volume, and hypertrophy? What do you think about this?
So that's an interesting question, and I'm assuming you're kind of referring to Brad's meta-analysis, Brad Schoenfeld's meta-analysis from a couple of years ago, and obviously there was recently a study published by Brad and colleagues in Medicine, Science and Sport and Exercise, which, caveat, I was actually a peer reviewer for that article,
nice.
And it was a really nice study, a hard study to do, particularly using trained participants. We've questioned the use of meta-analysis in this field in the past, purely from the perspective that there's a lot of heterogeneity between, variability between studies that have examined differences in volume, for example. Some use high load, some use low load, some look at upper body, some look at lower body, and it's possible that the interaction of some of these other variables might be impacting the nature of the relationship between volume and adaptation. But if you kind of discount that and just look at Brad's recent study, the data in their study does seem to suggest that there is a dose-response relationship with respect to muscle hypertrophy. Now, I know there's been some criticisms of the study in the sense that some of the additional changes in muscle thickness that were seen in the higher volume conditions might be a result of edema or fluid in the muscle, that's a distinct possibility. But just on the face of it, their data does seem to suggest this kind of linear dose response. But I don't know if you've seen it. Literally this week, I was involved in a study that was finished a while back now, but has only just been published, along with Paolo Gentile and colleagues James Fisher and Antonio Paoli and Victor Coswig and
all the 10 versus 20 sets in one session,
which looked at look to kind of characterize the dose-response relationship between volume and resistance training, volume and strength and hypertrophy adaptations in trained women. So I don't know if you've seen that study, but I can send it over if you like. So this one characterized it based on weekly volume. So it was 5 sets of 10 sets, 15 sets, and 20 sets. And they performed a kind of split routine and manipulated the number of sets per session, but essentially it was the volume of sets per week. And the results were very interesting in that we looked at a number of different sites for muscle hypertrophy. We looked at a number of different outcomes for strength, and we found pretty consistent. A pretty consistent kind of dose-response relationship, but one that was not linear in the sense that that Brad found or that their previous meta-analysis suggested. And what we actually found was that for pretty much every outcome, the 5 and 10 sets group, 5 and 10 sets per week, had larger increases in both strength and hypertrophy compared to the 15 and 20 sets per week. And the 15 sets typically did slightly better than the 20 set group. So there was kind of this almost inverted U kind of shape to the dose response curve, although statistically there weren't any differences between 5 and 10 sets per week. And I'm sure Paolo probably won't mind me saying this as well. They've also replicated this study in trained males, and it's currently under review at the moment, and also included a mid time point for that study and found very similar results, which kind of suggested that there was potentially an overtraining effect after the first 12 weeks of training for the higher set volume groups.
Oh yeah. I just looked it up, and yeah, it's I have seen this study, or I've seen someone posting a discussion of this study. And so, just to clarify, how many training sessions did this study involve per week, or how was the volume distributed?
So they trained twice per week. Hang on, I'm just going to pull up the table just so I don't accidentally say something that's not quite true. So they trained 3 times a week, but it was done as a kind of split routine of Mondays were a kind of upper body pressing session, Thursdays were upper body pulling session, and Fridays were lower body. So they did 3 exercises per session and manipulated the number of sets per exercise. So for example, the 5-set group did 2 sets on Mondays, for example, did 2 sets of barbell bench press, 2 sets of inclined barbell bench press, and 1 set of military press. And then the 10-set group did 4-4-2, 15-set did 5-5-5, and 20-set did 7-7-6. So we kind of manipulated like that. But for each kind of muscle group, they were essentially kind of trained once a week with varying set volumes per session.
Right. Okay. So, yeah, in the case of someone doing 20 sets per week, that would be within one session, right?
In this study, yeah.
Very interesting, and it would be really cool to see the same kind of setup with sort of modified variables such as the proximity to failure. Maybe instead of going to failure, maybe 1 set, 1 rep shy of failure, or 2 reps shy of failure, or maybe splitting up the sessions to kind of more frequent workouts, so maybe 2 or 3 times a week kind of frequencies, and distributing it over that. But nevertheless, it's a very interesting study. And also unique in the sense that kind of the intensity of effort was much better controlled, as from what I've seen at least, than in most studies. Couple of other concepts. So what do you think about the notion that as long as volume is equated in most studies, there doesn't seem to be a difference between a high rep work and low rep work. So you could be lifting very heavy weights or very light weights, and as long as the volume is the same, muscle growth also seems to be the same. How does this finding strike you generally?
So I think actually what we tend to see is with heavy, it's not necessarily that the volume, you get the same responses with heavy and light loads when volume is matched, because it's actually the case that when volume is matched, whether it's just straight volume in terms of number of sets and repetitions, or volume load is matched, you actually tend to see that heavier loads outperform lighter loads. But in order to, typically with lighter loads, to reach momentary failure, you have to perform a higher volume of repetitions, and that subsequently tends to result in a higher volume load as well. So actually, you tend to see that that there is greater adaptations in heavy load training compared to light load training when volume is matched. But when volume's not matched, by allowing them to train to failure in both conditions, you typically see that the responses are very, very similar. And some people have kind of, or from what I can tell, and from sort of reviewing studies and having discussions with authors about their sort of interpretation of their findings, so some seem to interpret that as suggesting the additional volume in the lower load conditions is what is driving the similar growth, whereas my interpretation would be slightly different, and that in actual fact it's very, very likely to be that the intensity of effort and thus subsequent motor unit recruitment, and thus stimulation and mechanical tension across those motor units and muscle fibers is probably what's resulting in the similar adaptations between the two.
Right. That actually is a good point to bring it up. Like, do you think that there is kind of a lower threshold of volume, which is required to achieve muscle growth? Like, so for example, do you think that the high intensity training crowds, kind of 1 set to failure per week sort of approach, is sufficient to kind of get someone to their genetic potential? Or how do you think about this concept of lower threshold of volume
I think that's a really interesting question because a lot of people will look at these sort of, anywhere between 6 to 24 week studies, and where we do see differences in terms of the adaptations produced by, for example, different volumes, people infer that over time, that gap between the adaptations will grow larger, and over a longer period of time, for example, higher volumes result in greater gains. Whereas, in reality, we have literally no data that has even tested this kind of idea of what happens longer term with these different training interventions. And so, I would speculate that it's highly likely that if continued for a long enough period of time, the typical kind of low volumes, even single sets to failure, will by and large, you'll reach your kind of genetic ceiling. It may take a different amount of time compared to maybe doing higher volumes, and I don't necessarily think that's because the additional volume is inherently better than the lower volumes. I think it probably comes more down to the practical implementation of that type of training. Like you said, it's questionable whether a lot of people do actually train to failure, properly. I always find it surprising the number of students, for example, here at the university that when we do any kind of demonstrations and I ask them, do they train to failure? And they nod their heads and say, oh, yeah, I always train to failure. And then after I've put them through a session, they've suddenly got a new conceptualization of what failure actually means. So I think, for a lot of people, additional volumes, coming back to the point we made earlier, is a way of potentially increasing the intensity of effort of their training, because they almost accumulate, it can be used to accumulate fatigue and thus increase the intensity of effort in the later parts of the workout. But no, I think, to simplify the answer, what's the minimum amount of volume you need to do? Something. And you're not going to grow if you don't lift weights. But I think that given a sufficient period of time, I would speculate that you'll eventually hit your kind of genetic ceiling, and that any differences in protocol are, in my opinion, highly unlikely to make much of a difference once you've kind of reached that point.
Yeah, and maybe this is where the discussion over frequency, or actually, there's two things that I think this brings up. One is whether, for example, 1 set per week kind of to failure protocol could get someone to the same place as someone doing 15 hard sets to failure, or close to failure at least per week. And but in a practical sense, maybe the guy who's doing 15 sets a week will simply in his lifetime get to his genetic potential, whereas the 1 set to failure guy won't, because we have a limited amount of time on Earth to actually train. But if time wasn't a factor, over time, the two people would kind of converge to the same point. So do you think that maybe there's an argument to be made that higher volumes can get you gains at a faster rate?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think, like you said, it comes down to the practical implications of it. But I think it's worth kind of saying as well that saying higher volumes, we then have to come back to, well, what do we mean by higher volumes? And does that necessarily mean that you need to be doing multiple sets within a session of the exercises that you're including? Or is it a case that, assuming you have the right sort of exercise selection, you can still, for all intents and purposes, do a relatively low volume workout, including single sets of a selection of exercises, perhaps done in a kind of split manner throughout the week, or maybe you do a couple of sessions a week that involve a kind of A and B full body routine where you just manipulate the exercises but are still performing only 1 set of each of those exercises, and you can still begin to accumulate volume that actually kind of falls in line with some of the recommendations from, in particular, from, for example, the meta-analysis from Brad a few years ago. There's a lack of data looking at greater than 10 sets per week, and there's only really a couple of studies that are coming out now, including ours and Brad's recent one, and one from Dr. Lee Breen's lab, which are showing some mixed results. So maybe over time we'll learn more about whether really high volumes do in fact eke out additional adaptation. I'm skeptical, but we might find that. But actually, you could take that kind of like 10 sets a week approach and quite easily come up with a protocol that hits that 10 sets per muscle group per week. But that most high intensity training kind of advocates would look at and see that as being a high intensity training protocol. So I think we sometimes talk past each other in this sense when we start to label ourselves as being in any particular camps. And actually, there's a lot more similarities in terms of the typical recommendations that people are giving than we typically think there are.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of failure, how much do you actually think that's going actually to the point of concentric muscular failure? So the point where you are failing a rep. So if you were to do like a machine chest press, you're attempting that, 11th rep after the 10th, and you're failing it midway through the set, or the rep rather. How much do you think that is actually necessary? And do you think that there's kind of a point of diminishing returns with this? Kind of the typical recommendation given out in bodybuilding circles, for example, is to stop at the point where you're sure that you couldn't complete the next rep with good form at least. And so kind of 1 rep or 2 reps shy of failure is the kind of colloquial term here.
Yeah. That's a really interesting question, and it's pertinent because I gave a talk at the ACSM earlier this year, kind of covering that topic, and I'm giving a kind of updated version of that talk this weekend in Bologna. So I guess there's 2 ways of looking at it. There's the kind of do we know whether or not proximity to failure, and as such, the intensity of effort, do we know what the dose-response relationship is with respect to kind of hypertrophic adaptation? And I think the simple answer is we don't really know whether or not or what the dose-response relationship actually is in terms of its nature, because we don't have enough studies that have looked at varying degrees of proximity to failure and their subsequent impact on adaptation. What we do typically have is studies that have looked at, broadly speaking, either higher or lower efforts. They've kind of looked at it in a kind of dichotomous fashion. And so what we do tend to see is the literature does seem to suggest that, higher efforts typically outperform lower efforts, but the closer those kind of efforts are, along a spectrum, the less obvious any kind of difference is, or we're not necessarily able to detect it. So, for example, there was a recent study which looked at heavy and light loads, either to failure or not to failure. We can come back to this idea of it's questionable whether or not people are really training to failure when it's reported that they are. But they found no differences really between heavy loads to failure or heavy loads not to failure, light loads to failure or light loads not to failure. But in this sense, this was in untrained participants, and both conditions were relatively high failure, as in one was to failure, quote unquote, and one was very close to failure. Now we've done a couple of studies with our colleagues in Germany, it's Jürgen Giesing again, where we've actually asked people to kind of try and stop at that kind of 1 rep short of failure, which we kind of term it as self-determined rep max, because we kind of think of repetition maximum as being the maximum number of complete repetitions you could do. The problem is you can never know what that is unless you actually train to failure, because every time you complete a rep, unless you try the next one, you never know whether you could have also completed that. And so we kind of refer to it as a self-determined rep max, stopping when you think you'll fail on the next rep if you attempted it. And in untrained participants, coming back to this study where we kind of looked at a typical hit versus a typical kind of like higher volume approach, we found that there was greater adaptations in the hit group, but there are also differences in volume there. And in a separate study with trained individuals where we did try to kind of match the volume load between the conditions, we found that the group that tried to stop 1 rep short of failure didn't really make much in the way of additional adaptations, whereas the group that was training to failure continued to make improvements. So I think there is, in a practical sense, some benefit to training to failure rather than attempting to try and stop short of failure. And I think part of the reason for that is because we're just really bad at predicting how close to failure we are. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And I think part of it is because without instruction or without kind of thinking about it, we tend to anchor our perceptions of effort on how uncomfortable the exercise feels. So like the example you gave of doing like a set of squats, particularly if you're using kind of low to moderate loads, like a high rep set of squats feels horrible. And I imagine a lot of people probably reach what they think is failure, but really they're just volitionally ending the exercise because it feels uncomfortable. But we've done a number of studies, or we've published one study, and we've got another study in review looking essentially at people's ability to predict how many reps they could do to failure. And so we published one, I think it was end of last year, where we asked people to kind of give predictions based on their prior training experience of how many reps they thought they could do to failure. And we found that typically people sort of underpredict by, around about 2 repetitions. There seems to be an improvement with experience where kind of people who have been training for multiple years underpredict by about 1 repetition. But even then, that suggests that small differences in rep number might have an impact on, or small differences in proximity to failure might have an impact on adaptation. I can tell you these results as a kind of sneak preview, but we did a really cool study recently, or I think it's a cool study. I don't know if anyone else will. But we did a kind of deception study. So we recruited participants and told them that what we were doing was doing a reliability study. And we wanted them to do two they came in on 4 separate days. And on 2 of those days, they did a set of self-determined rep max, so they were told to stop when they felt they'd fail on the next repetition, and on the other 2 days they did set repetitions to failure. But we just told them that what we were doing was looking at the between-day reliability between the number of reps they did within each condition. What we were really doing was actually comparing whether the self-determined rep max really was 1 rep short of failure. And so we did 2 experiments. We did one where we used a kind of baseline 70% of 1 RM, and another one where we actually tested their maximal voluntary contraction on that day. So we kind of captured, how strong they were on that day, just to try and reduce any between-day variability. And we kind of found similar results in that. Participants these were trained participants as well. And in the first experiment, they tend to underpredict by somewhere between 1 to 2 repetitions. And in the second experiment, they underpredict by somewhere between sort of 2 to 4 repetitions. So, in reality, when people are trying to manipulate their proximity to failure, it seems like they're actually pretty bad at it. And so from a practical sense, we don't know whether there is a kind of threshold for optimizing adaptation based on proximity to failure, because there's just not the research to kind of tell us what that is. So from a practical sense, it makes sense to me to essentially just train to failure to ensure that you have passed that threshold. And then you've kind of like covered all bases in that sense.
Right. Okay. So I think I understand your kind of fundamental take on what constitutes effective training. So we need to train hard. I get that. And so if someone comes to you who is a guy, let's say, who is pretty well trained, what would be like kind of a practical sort of average protocol that you would put someone on? I don't mean specifically in terms of exercises and things, but in terms of like what sort of weights to lift, what kind of intensity of, like, for example, 1 rep max, what percentage of that to lift, how many sets to do, how many reps to do, all these kinds of things. Like, what would be a a good general baseline to start somebody, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I tend to, I think because of the, my interpretation of there being, in the grand scheme of things, so little difference between lots of different sort of iterations of training interventions, assuming, people are actually turning up and training and putting in, a decent intensity of effort. Everything else becomes, by and large, a matter of preference from my perspective. So I always like to kind of strip it down to something really basic and get people to start from there, and then tell them to experiment with what they actually enjoy and are likely to stick to and adhere to. So I'll typically get people to start, depending upon their individual kind of recovery and how it generally makes them feel, of anywhere between sort of 1 to 3 workouts a week. Because, by and large, the frequency of training, again, is something that, it may influence the results, but it's not having a huge impact from my interpretations of the literature. I tend to err towards kind of 2 days a week as a kind of baseline, because I always think about it, and this is kind of putting my public health recommendations head on as well, is that if you we've been having a lot of debate around this, because we're currently in the process in the UK of revising our physical activity guidelines, and most people don't know, but the physical activity guidelines do suggest that you should do what they call muscle strengthening activity, which for me is resistance training. And they recommend doing it twice a week. Well, actually, the most recent data suggests that, assuming, you're performing a minimum kind of volume, it doesn't matter whether you do that in one session a week or you split it across multiple sessions. But from a practical sense, we've had the discussion that the problem is, if you tell people to do it once a week and they miss a session, well, then they've not trained for 2 weeks. Whereas if they do it twice a week and they miss one session, it's not the end of the world. So in practical sense, I typically start with kind of twice a week. A small selection of exercises that target all the major kind of muscle groups of the body. Tend to favor whole body routines because, again, it comes back to this idea of if you miss one workout, then you're still going to at least train all of the major muscle groups at least once per week, and encourage people to, to perform single set to momentary failure, or as close as they possibly can get to that, and then play around with it from there and find, what you enjoy. Some people like sticking to a program and just doing that. Some people enjoy variety and changing things up, maybe adding in some different exercises, maybe increasing the volume, maybe training a bit more frequently, using, different loads. But I think a lot of it comes down to, finding what your personal preference is for training, and then just training consistently and training to a sufficient intensity of effort. Everything else kind of becomes window dressing after that for me.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That was nicely laid out. And do you think if someone is pretty highly trained and is doing as much as we can actually have an objective definition for this, a high-ish volume of training, so like 10 plus sets a week, and let's say that the person is actually happens to be one of those individuals who actually trains to 1 rep shy of failure per set and is not just fooling him or herself. Do you think there is an inherent reason or to reduce the volume of training for that person? Do you think that he could actually get better results by doing that?
Well, if you go by the data from the recent study that we published with Paolo Gentile, and also, so we've got similar data in trained men, which we're currently looking at publishing. I think the data that we've got shows that there's very little difference between sort of 5 to 10 sets per week in trained participants, but that increasing the volume much higher than that may lead to a kind of overtraining effect potentially. So I think if someone's kind of reaching that kind of 10 sets per week recommendation that comes from these meta-analyses, I don't necessarily think that they'll gain additional, they'll gain much in the way of additional adaptation from reducing the volume, but it's very likely that they'll be getting similar adaptations from reducing the volume. And so it comes down more to a kind of practical sense again, in that, if if you're limited for time, then you can reduce the volume per week and maybe fit it in a bit more easy and still likely get very similar adaptations. But if you're the type of person who loves training, then stick to the volume you're doing, and you're probably going to be producing largely the same effects. Of course, it's always worth pointing out, as much as it kind of irks me somewhat that this is always the kind of fallback, but all studies report essentially kind of what we would consider point estimates for an effect in a population. So, if a study shows that there are similar results from 5 or 10 sets per week, then what we're saying is that in trained men or trained women, the population effect that we're estimating is that there's no difference. Of course, there's always going to be variation around that population effect for individuals, though. And so there's, to an extent, self-experimentation that's required to figure out what seems to be working best for you. But there's always people always need to realize that that self-experimentation it's difficult to infer cause and effect from it. For yourself, it's nigh impossible to infer cause and effect and then translate that to someone else as well. So people bash the idea that studies report means, but in actual fact, in reality, from a statistical perspective, the means that are reported by studies are your best bet for a starting point. And then from there, you can self-experiment to figure out what seems to be working best for you, but it doesn't go back in the other direction. So I think people just need to be cautious of using their own anecdotes to try and influence other people's training. So I guess that would be kind of my perspective on that.
Yeah, that's very well said. Just kind of a random question to the end. What are your thoughts on super slow training?
So I think it's a viable option. From a kind of adaptive response perspective, there's actually, there's not that much research that has looked at different repetition durations in resistance training. Most historical studies that have looked at, the quote-unquote typical super slow approach, which is sometimes interpreted as a kind of 5-5 or 10-10. Most commonly, it's a kind of 10-second concentric, 10-second eccentric. Most of the studies that have compared that to other repetition durations have also manipulated other variables. So typically, they'll reduce the load for the super slow. So they're training with a lower load, they're training with longer repetition durations, and they're comparing that to training with higher loads and faster repetition durations. And so there's a lot of kind of messy studies out there which are difficult to sort of interpret what really, whether there really is any difference between a super slow protocol and a normal kind of single set to failure protocol with a 3-3 or a typical kind of 1-1 type repetition duration. But we did, our colleagues over at Discover Strength in the US, which we've run a number of studies with over the years. The latest one that we've completed and published was actually the first to look at differences in repetition duration whilst attempting to maintain parity in terms of the loads across the conditions. So we actually had a group that did, and these are all trained participants again as well. They're all existing kind of clients at Discover Strength who've been training with them for, in most cases, multiple years. We had one group that did the typical kind of, 2-4 hit type rep duration, 2-second concentric, 4-second eccentric. We had a group that did the 10-second concentric, 10-second eccentric, super slow type protocol. And then we also added in Dr. Ellington Darden published a book in recent years where he presented a protocol called the 30-30-30 protocol, which is essentially a 30-second eccentric followed by a 30-second concentric followed by a 30-second eccentric. And so we examined that as well. And we had all groups trained to failure. So with the 30-30-30 group, we had them attempt a repetition after completing the 30-30-30 to make sure that they had actually reached failure. and we didn't actually find any differences between those protocols in any of the outcomes that we looked at. And so what it says to me is that, much like many other variables, when we're controlling for intensity of effort, there seems to be, by and large, very similar adaptations. So I think I've used this phrase on another podcast with Lawrence Neal. That kind of, it seems to me that assuming you're training to failure, all roads seem to lead to Rome, in the sense that, most adaptations are largely very similar. Whether you go fast or you go slow, whether you lift heavy weights or you lift light weights, whether you do slightly more volume or slightly less volume, whether you chuck in some advanced techniques after going to failure or not, it seems to all very much be, if there is any differences, they're likely to be very, very small and probably only meaningful to certain individuals or populations.
Awesome. Yeah, that's super interesting, and I am actually really curious to find out more about this in the future, because if it is indeed the case that rep duration doesn't really matter and you could accomplish the same thing with much lighter loads but going slower, that could have huge implications for things like injury prevention and kind of just the sustainability of training. So it's super, super interesting concept.
I'll add one thing on that though, and again, part of my shift more towards an interest in the public health side of physical activity and exercise, and trying to figure out ways of getting people just to do it in the first place, because a lot of the conversations, and don't get me wrong, I love having the conversations around the minutiae of training, but there's a lot of people who just don't do anything at all, and so I'm interested in how do you get people to actually start resistance training in the first place, considering the benefits it can have. And one thing that's worth pointing out is that, a lot of people will anecdotally say super slow is really boring. And so if that's the case, it might well be that it's potentially safer. That's a potential bonus. But if people find it boring, then they might not do it. Now, that's not to say everyone will. But it's also worth, thinking about other elements that might impact whether people do or don't train, or whether they stick to the training or not. And that's things like, their kind of enjoyment factor. We've done a lot of work looking at the amount of discomfort that's produced by different training approaches. So we've typically looked at heavy and light loads performed to failure, and find that, it's probably no surprise to anyone, but light loads are more uncomfortable when performed to failure than heavy loads. And so, a lot of the discourse around heavy and light load training has been that, well, look, light loads produce similar adaptations. So light loads are a good option because, for example, elderly individuals who are fearful of injury risk and things like that, they could benefit from light loads. Whereas a flip side to that is, well, actually, light loads are much more uncomfortable than doing heavy loads. So maybe heavy loads are better because, you're more likely to, you're less likely to experience discomfort whilst doing them. But again, I think it all comes back to personal preference. Personally, I love the discomfort from training hard. I'm a bit of a masochist in that respect. So I'll admit it feels uncomfortable, but I like it. So
yeah. I'm very much with you on that one. There's kind of a sweet spot to be hit between optimality and sustainability from an enjoyment perspective. So that's very well said. So James, I think I asked you all of my questions. So yeah, thank you so much for doing this. So, I guess just let people know where they can find you, maybe take a look at your work and just any kind of future projects that you're working on at the moment.
Yeah, sure. First, thanks for having me on. It's always fun to chat, talk shop, as I like to say. So I'm always happy to do so. People can find me on, I'm on social media. I tend not to use Facebook very much anymore, so I'm mainly on Twitter, and people can find me at James Steele II. And I tend to be pretty active on there. I share a lot of our research, other people's research, any interesting kind of thoughts I might have, and then also random other things which are completely unrelated to my work or job, but just stuff I like. If people want to get in contact with me via email, then they can either email me at my university address, which is james.steele@solent.ac.uk, or they can email me at the UKActive Research Institute, and that's James Steele, all one word, at UKActive.org.uk. I seem to have a lot of projects on the go at the moment. On the kind of training side of things, like I said, we've got this deception study, which I'm quite interested in getting the findings out for and getting people's thoughts on that. We've been doing some work as well, looking at comparisons between resistance training and kind of quote-unquote cardio modalities whilst controlling for effort and duration of exercise. So we did an acute study we published at the beginning of this year. We're halfway through doing a training study, and so I'm excited to get that finished up and get the results out around that. And on the other side of things, on the UKActive side of things, I'm doing some work around exercise referral schemes. So where kind of physicians, GPs refer patients for exercise. And we're currently putting together a big database of schemes. We've currently got about 25,000 people's worth of data, looking at a lot of different outcomes from exercise referral schemes and looking at what kinds of schemes seem to be best. And my hope is that the ones that do resistance training are going to be the ones that perform best, but we'll wait and see what the data says. So yeah, lots of stuff going on.
Cool. Awesome. Well, James, thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you.
No, and you.
All right, I hope you enjoyed this episode with Dr. James Steele, and if you did, and you haven't done it already, please drop a like and let me know in the comments what you thought, and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Next week, another episode will come out on this topic, so stay tuned for that one. And to be sure that you won't miss it, hit that bell icon next to the subscribe button, and then you'll be the first to be notified when that comes out. So once again, I hope you had a good time listening to this, and with that, see you next time.